things that happen that are traumatic, or when there's a serious incident, it doesn't even have to be abuse. It could be, some incident where, maybe there was physical harm, or people in her family got hurt, or, it could be something where it's really like altering, like there's this kind of shamanic saying, there's the pain that hurts, and then there's the pain that alters. And so when you look at something like this, we're really looking at something that kind of altered the person. And it doesn't even really necessarily need to be, for me, I don't need to know the details. I'm just looking for like potentials. And when you have potentials like this, the byproduct of it is the production of a lot of lower emotions, and like more activation of the instinctive mind. And what that tends to do is, over a period of time, it causes like physical health issues. It's usually not immediate. It could be a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades later. It depends. Sometimes it's within a few years, sometimes it's longer. And so really what we're looking at is excessive amounts of lower emotions. And why that is important is that lower emotions and the instinctive mind keep you in like more of a reactive state, rather than being able to make choices or cognitively process things. You're just kind of always reacting. And then 2, the difficulty is it really makes the mental faculties, not by choice, but because of the activation of these lower components, it makes them like not be able to see things in depth, and really it becomes harder to discern like consequences of actions. And it's not because they're not smart, and it's not because they're not intelligent, it's not because they don't want to. I mean, all those things can be there, but the overactivation of the lower emotions and the instinctive mind really make it so it is a hard thing to overcome. It's like kind of like being underwater trying to take a deep breath. It's just not going to happen. And so the goal is for both physical health. When you see a lot of inflammatory conditions, it could be a physical trauma, but usually there's a byproduct of some sort of trauma, either a single incident or over a period of time. And sometimes it could just be implied trauma, like implied threat of, there was this one guy I treated one time where nothing ever happened, but there was always the implied threat of violence through his childhood. And so nothing ever happened. Like dad never touched him, never hit him, never anything. But there was always this implied thing: if you got on a line, you were going to get the backhand, or taken outside and have the crap beat out of you. And so with that, going after symptoms will be, you can bring a little bit of relief, but what happens as you start to calm these things down, is the symptoms is the lower emotions become more, the instinctive mind becomes more, not less. And so the thing with excessive amounts of lower emotions is it's really hard to have the heart activate, because of so much like you could almost call it like a gravity of sorts. There's so much lower emotion that it doesn't really allow for the heart to activate. It's stuck in the lower centers. And sometimes the lower emotions are not even of the solar plexus, they're of the lower centers. And so really your goal is to go through and clean up the lower emotions and the instinctive mind um, a bit. And as that starts to shift, um, the first thing that usually happens is they do have some issues, regardless of what happened. Usually the byproduct is abandonment type issues or feelings come up. And again, it's not about the story, it's more about just the interaction with people. Just times where they just weren't embraced or didn't fit in or got rejected. There's an accumulation over a period of time. And so you can go at it several different ways. I can talk you through how to do it mechanically, but part of a lot of times how we go through an approach treating physical conditions, a lot of times I usually have integrated approaches of treating the lower emotions, mental components, some neurological aspects. It's all kind of woven into the therapeutic approaches. So a lot of times that's why I don't do a lot of use this for this symptom, use this for this symptom, because that works for some things sometimes, but usually more acute. When you're talking about the conditions that you're talking about, more chronic, even if they didn't have the root cause being from trauma or emotions or mind, it has a wear and tear on the emotions and mind. And so it doesn't really matter what got started, but that there's some sort of history. You have to kind of treat both like physically and you could say psychologically, but I use that term really loosely because you're really opening up more of lower emotions rather than the psyche, and you're really dealing more with the instinctive mind rather than the mental body. And the instinctive mind is tied to instinctual responses that are based on lower center activity. Instinct means that you're not processing it in your brain or in your mind, your body's reacting. And then a lot of times you try to make sense of it after the fact, right? And so a lot of people are actually running on lower emotions in the instinctive mind. Another way of even saying the instinctive mind could be somebody who's very driven by the stress response, by the striving for comfort and the striving to just maintain everything, not stepping out of the box, not embracing new things, not doing things different. This is all a highly inflexible stress response. And so, a lot of things that we've done over the last couple of years have been really about re-educating the stress response, starting to unwind the mind, the prefrontal cortex, the lower emotions. And so in a way, you could start her kind of anywhere and it would start having some impact, but let's go through and just talk about mechanics for a little bit, right? Like I think a lot of times if the mechanics are understood, even if you're not doing it with oils, you can do it in a lot of different ways. I mean, I do this with practices in Buddhism. I did it with energy healing. I did it with osteopathic manipulation. I do it with oils. We did it with herbs. There's lots of different ways to do it once you understand the mechanics. And so the very first thing you're really wanting to do is you're wanting to clean up almost like these different levels or layers within the lower centers. And when I say lower centers, I'm meaning navel, spleen, Mingmen, which is your low back, tied to kidneys and adrenals, the sex chakra, and then the bottom of the tailbone, which is the basic chakra. Also included in that is the back of the head, which is opposite the ajna, going to the back head, and then the basic is tied to the aspect of the will that is about physical survival. It is the defense mechanism. It's part of how you interact with the environment, and these traumatic events really can distort how a person interacts with the environment. I'm not saying this with any judgment. It is literally a type of conditioning, and we get conditioned all the time. And so good and bad. And so with that, when you're looking at the basic chakra, you have to take into account also that is tied to the function of the arms and legs. It's tied to the function of the kidneys, and the kidneys are a byproduct, or I should say a byproduct of the kidneys is the impact on what you would call the protective webs, which are also associated with the basic chakra. It's a way for you to energetically protect yourself from the environment. Now, the thing with all of this, with the protective webs, for example, is it's your ability to protect from energies, elementals, from the environment, but also there's a certain level of contamination there that also has like an attracting effect on things from the environment. It also affects how you perceive the external world. So really, this is complicated, but not. It really, it's complicated because we have over a period of time kind of mixed in lower emotions with higher emotions in like a psychology or a psychological approach. When you look at lower emotions and the instinctive mind as more physiology, it becomes much, much easier to treat. Much easier to treat. And it also inhibits the tendency for the person to feel that they need to resolve something psychologically. Because when you're dealing with lower emotions and the instinctive mind, it is types of agitation. If you go through and process the story and what happened and the issues with different people, psychologically you feel better. It does not change the physiological emotions, and it does not change the instinctive mind. The only thing that goes through and actually changes that is different types of transmutation, either purification or transmutation. And a lot of times when you go through and you do purification, it just allows the body to transmute. So we can talk about this from a superficial level. We can talk about it like in a mechanical way, and I can give you like kind of a mechanical way to go through and treat. But this treatment sounds like it could be something you fire off in a session or two. This needs to be drawn out over probably months. You do a small component and you move on. You do another small component, you move on. You do another small component, you move on. It's not going to happen all at once, because it's not just cleaning and regulating an area a little bit. It's having to go and be very, very thorough. Excuse me. I drank something with bubbles, so I keep having a little burpee sound. Sorry. So with that, one of the oils that works really good. This is an area where I think oils really shine. I think they really shine. Energy healing or osteopathic manipulation, you can go through and treat this, but if you don't really have a lot of skill sets and really knowing exactly what you're treating, um, it take you a long time to make very little progress. When you're working with the plants by their nature kind of do what they do. You can guide them to do it more quickly, but the thing with plants is it can shift your brain and your nervous system very, very quickly because it's tied to scent. And scent is a way to change perception and behavior very, very quickly. It's a way to physicalize energetics that might, if you just do an energy healing, might take a while. But if you complement it with something physical, the process can be very, very rapid. And by going through and doing inhalation or applying to the skin or taking a few drops internally of something can really hit the energetic component and the physical component and make drastic shifts that if the person doesn't even understand what's happening, it still happens, even though either the therapist or the patient don't quite understand what's happening. The plants will actually kind of teach you the process. And so I think plants really shine in this area. And in shamanic traditions, plants are considered to be like a form of teachers, like these little plant teachers. It's because of how much they can make you shift. And so one of the things that you can always look at, I'm going to visit a couple of different pieces for a little bit, and then I'll draw it together. And I could have just answered this really quickly, but I think so many people could benefit from this, and for so many conditions. I mean, I have many people that we've given some directions on how to go through and do healing for different conditions, and we're really doing variations of what I'm going to talk about. To help alleviate the symptoms so that when you go through and do some symptom-oriented treatment, it sticks. But a lot of times why the symptom-oriented treatment doesn't work is the excessive amounts of lower emotions and lower instinctive mental activity. And so, nobody really kind of escapes this. It's something that impacts everybody. And even if you're trying to deepen your meditation, if you're trying to deepen the activation of the heart, you're trying to deepen the activation of the blue pearl, you're trying to increase the amount of soul energy coming in, you're trying to physicalize soul energy, all of these same mechanics play out. There is no escaping this. There is no other way of, getting around this. You don't get to ignore these components and expect to be healthy or to be spiritual, to be loving. I mean, these mechanics are their mechanics. People talk about them in different ways. They use different language sometimes, but we're just going to talk about it from a mechanical point of view. Okay, so a lot of times when upper faculties like the heart, the mental faculties, the ability to process something. A person's having hard time. In this particular case, talking about forgiveness issues, there is an emotional component, but a lot of that is usually instinctive mental functions, instinctive mind. And so you actually have a couple different kinds of transmutation here. And so step one is it's not like they're not even trying to make the choice or emotionally they can't get there. It's like the physiology actually just weighs them down. And so a lot of times why we talk about lymphatic function so much is it's one of the ways to go through and clean up some of the lower emotions. And so you could go through and you could say, lymphatic function and just working on the lymphatic system. Because if you look at fibromyalgia, inflammatory issues in the gut, there is a lot of lymphatic function that's being impacted. But I want to be even more specific than just saying, no, I'll treat the lymphatic system. One of the things that you're really wanting to do is you're wanting to treat the component of the immune system that goes after viruses and bacteria. And you're wanting to treat lymph nodes. You're wanting to treat the lymph nodes. And so the one oil that just, truly shines in this area, I'm not talking about re-educating right now. I'm just talking about purification. You're just cleaning up the body. You're not trying to re-educate the immune system, which that component, we're going to talk about this coming up weekend. Re-educating the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, and really we're talking about re-educating physiology so that emotional, mental functions actually improve, right? So the thing you're wanting to do is use bay laurel. Bay laurel, boy, where can I start with bay laurel? Let me just start with this. I can't say enough good things about bay laurel. Bay laurel is very good for fighting off viruses. It's one of the most dynamic oils for fighting off bacteria. It actually will treat staph and strep infections. It's amazing, right? And the other thing that it does is physically is it is decongesting very specifically to the lymph nodes. Now, part of what it does is it helps to stimulate the upper mental faculties. It helps to activate the crown. It helps to activate a little bit of the right side of the brain. And in ancient times, they used to use large amounts of bay laurel for intuition, prophecy, things like that. And it's because of how well it cleans up the lower centers. It actually activates the things in the brain and part of the mind by how well it cleans up the body, and how well it cleans up the navel, the sex, the spleen, the mingmen, the basic. Basically, it increases the vibration of your lower nature. And so just by using kind of hefty dosages of that, you can really start to help a person start shedding some of the lower emotional component, lower instinctive mind component. You don't even have to have them breathe patterns, just apply it to the body. Large dosages to the back. You can mix it in alcohol or witch hazel and have them rub it all over their legs, their abdomen, even, the whole body. Baths of bay laurel can be very, very purifying, especially with salt. So in the old Greek tradition, they used to put wreaths of laurel on the Olympians, the people who could perform and basically like produce a result, right? Produce a result. And so a lot of times when even you're looking at obstacles or difficulty in doing something, the lower centers are usually low vibration because of trauma or conditioning, and a lot of emotion, a lot of instinctive mental function. And so if you look at somebody who can produce results, it's because they don't have the lower emotional baggage. Bottom line, if you just bottom line it, they don't have a lot of lower emotional baggage. And so one of the ways to do it over a period of time is you can just start with going through and treating with pretty hefty dosages of Bayloral. Bayloral will help open up the lymphatic function, help reduce the congestion in the lymph nodes or the lack of function in the lymph nodes, but it raises the vibration of those lower centers, which means they start kind of releasing some of the lower emotions, and their upper mental faculties somewhat begin to be activated. Now, one of the things that you'll want to do in conjunction with that is, right off the bat, is you have a couple of choices. One, you could use rosemary verbena. A little bit stronger choice would be the blue Tuscan rosemary. And then a substantially stronger choice is saffron. And on a daily basis, the Bayloral needs to be used on a daily basis, and the rosemary, either rosemary or saffron, needs to be applied between the eyebrows like 1 to 2 times a day, right? 1 to 2 times a day. And part of what that's doing is this center here is in charge of sequencing all the chakras, right? And so whenever you see some chronic health issues, whenever you see a lot of lower emotions, when you see a lot of instinctive mental activity, the center actually inhibits, and the forehead will overactivate in a negative way, right? And the throat overactivates. The jaws can overactivate. The back head gets real super congested. Basically, the person can't cognitively process. By putting it here over a period of time, you're helping to regulate the centers so that the energy body can start kicking off some of the lower emotions. Now, the way to augment this is to I usually use mugwort supreme rather than just mugwort, because you're using mugwort and artemisia together. But if you want to do artemisia or mugwort, you can, but you're going to have them apply it to the joints of the arms and the legs. And remember, the joints of the arms and legs are extensions of the basic chakra. So part of what you're trying to do is you're trying to make that stress response or the basic chakra more flexible, so that, for one, you can release things and you kind of kick it out of defense mode, so that higher parts of the will can become more activated in this arena, and you're able to allow it to start regulating, so that it actually starts to address the inflammation and the soft tissue issues in the body. It will also start having somewhat of a purifying effect on protective webs. So you have, in the early stages, you have Bayloral, which is raising the vibration of the lower centers. You have a form of rosemary or a form of or saffron between the eyebrows, and then mugwort on the arms and the legs. Eventually, you'll shift from mugwort and you would shift over to sandalwood. But at this stage of the game, it's actually usually a little bit more gentle to do it with mugwort, and mugwort opens up the arms and the legs to a higher degree. And when there starts to be more energy flowing through the arms and legs, you're already diminishing the tendency for automatic behavior. You're already diminishing the tendency for the instinctive mind to be calling the shots. So the tendency is, over a period of time, you're not doing this for like a symptom or trying to relieve something that's happening today. You're looking big picture. But like, even with that, after a few days of doing this, the mugwort to the arms and the legs begins to reduce the tendency to get triggered, right? It improves health, non-specifically, but your body starts functioning a bit better, but the tendency is to reduce the tendency to be triggered. Now, that's a double-edged sword, because when things start to calm down, people begin to realize how much they hurt, how much they're upset, how much they're angry, how much they're sad. They begin to realize, like, wow, you know what? My feelings are really hurt, or wow, I really got screwed over, or wow, I really feel abandoned. And so I usually don't have people do this like aggressively. Like if they fall off from doing it, I just keep trying to nudge them into doing it for a little while. Um, you know, not everybody will do it daily, but uh, when things really start getting cleaned up, you might be doing it 2 to 3 times a day. But at first, just once daily is really all you're really kind of shooting for. Then once that's happened, this next piece I have to look up. It's in my notes. Hold on, give me just a second. Where did I put this? Maybe it's just that. Psychological mechanics. Okay. Boy, I can't believe we're talking about this. Okay. I mean, we easily could have made this into a class, but I usually just do this like one-on-one or in small groups. I'm going to send you something and you can post it, but I'm going to talk you through it at the same time, but prevent you having to write everything down. I'm going to send it to Samantha and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so here's the mechanics.
Be just a sec, guys. I'll get it up for you though. Okay, just that.
Yeah, so she's going to post actually 2 patterns, and just as a side note, Letty, these are also 2 patterns that you can add to the list. I don't think you might have variations on them, but
I haven't started sharing yet, guys. Give me one sec.
okay. So they're posted. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through the pattern first. Okay, so first let's drop down to the lower emotions. The lower emotions, talking about how the arms and legs are tied to automatic behaviors. The arms are tied a little bit more to the instinctive mind, and the legs are tied more to lower emotions, right? And so if you look at lower emotions, starting with the hips, the knees, the ankles, the soles of the feet, when you go through and you work, I haven't talked about oils yet. I'm just talking about mechanics, right? So when you work the hips, the knees, the ankles, and the soles of the feet, the next byproduct of that is it makes lower emotions expel from the spine, right? So when you release something very deeply, the last place it usually comes out is the spine, right? As it starts to leave the spine, the next phase is it begins to hit the brain. So in Kabbalistic teachings, in shamanic teachings, the inner teachings, I should say, even in some of the osteopathic principles, um, the, the, the brain or the mind is tied to the endocrine functioning through the nervous system, so your brain, right? But the spinal cord is an extension of the mental body. And so when you go through and you hit the spine, the next natural progression is the next thing that starts to unwind is actually brain and brain function. And so a lot of times, even if you stop there, the emotions will continue to release. But if you let it incubate for several hours, you'll start to notice that there'll be a little pressure in the solar plexus or the lower abdomen, and it's because it's starting to release things from the navel. And so the navel is tied to the activation of the upper faculties. It's also tied to vitality of the body, vitality of the spleen, your overall endurance and stamina. And so you would still treat the navel, and then 1.5 inches below the navel, the navel minor. How clean everything gets cleaned up, and then how much you purify the navel will dictate how much of the heart that can become activated, the ability to transmute things emotionally. And so by going through and treating this component, just this right here will be substantial. Now, remember, the navel is in charge of regulating the lower centers, right? Your lower nature is regulated by the navel chakra. And so by going through and beginning to treat this, just by going through and treating with Baylor right off the bat, these lower centers are already starting to become cleaner, and they're starting to raise in vibration. And so even that term, what does that even mean? Like raising in vibration. So one, it means improvement in function, right? But when something raises in vibration, it means there's a higher potential for soul energy to be integrated and then to start to regulate your physiology. So part of allowing greater soul contact and more soul integration into the physical form is again tied to cleaning up these lower emotions. And so by going through and hitting this particular area, just that will significantly reduce the tendency of being triggered and reduce the tendency of being weighed down by the emotions. And so the next component of it would actually be the pattern tied to sexual transmutation. The sexual transmutation is actually transmuting lower emotions. So again, that would be sex, heart, throat, crown, right? And so let's jump up to the instinctive mind, where now you're hitting the armpits, the elbows, the wrists, the palms. Soon as you unwind that component, the armpits, the elbows, the wrists, the palms, the very first thing that starts to happen, whatever you're targeting, right? Whatever you're targeting begins to be processed and partially released somewhat from not your throat, but your back throat, right? Your back throat. And so When that starts to unwind, the next place that really starts to open up is the jaws. And so the jaws are tied to the throat chakra, to lower mental function. And remember, the throat chakra is tied to the creative process. And so whatever you're thinking repeatedly, whatever you're feeling repeatedly, whatever you're thinking intensely or repetitive attracts energy from the environment, right? So when there is a lot of lower emotions, when there's a lot of instinctive mental activity, part of what's happening is you're attracting these things from the environment and helping to bring them into form. And so just by unwinding the arms, right? Unwinding the arms, hitting the back throat, hitting the jaw, you're already starting to unwind what you're drawing in from the environment and bringing into form. You're basically starting to slow down the conditioning and the manifestation of the conditioning into always being a repetitive pattern, right? And so this is why the lymphatic system is tied to the throat chakra, is it goes hand in hand. There is no difference. The tendency for high creativity and the tendency for lymphatic function, or how well the lymphatic function, they're just different parts of the spectrum. They're not something that are separate and are influencing each other. It is literally just different pieces of the same puzzle, right? And so soon as you start to unwind the jaws, the next thing that happens is the temples. And the temples are starting to impact your prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex is tied to executive function, right? Executive function is how you go through and emotionally learn and make choices and execute things and form strategies and do things. So a lot of times this has been conditioned so much that you're on like you're just almost like in, even automatic behavior doesn't touch it. It's just, you're not trying to figure things out. You're just trying to like minimize damages, trying to minimize pain, trying to not be hurt, trying not to embarrass yourself, things like that. When this gets unwound, you actually start to see more consequences to the actions, and you can even perceive potential consequences, so that you start breaking out of patterns and you start making different choices, right? And so the temples at some point actually become quite substantial. If you were to clairvoyantly look at somebody's brain, the two spots that don't have a lot of energy, or the energy is reduced compared to the other parts of the brain, is the back part of the lower part of the brain, which is tied to more primal functions, and then the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is again tied to emotional learning, strategy, things like this, how you are coping in the world. And so even at this point, you're starting to change how the person perceives things and how they process information, and you're starting to give them the ability to shift and make different choices, right? Then you're starting to move down to the throat minor, which is the bottom part of the throat. And again, this is starting to be tied more to respiratory function. And respiratory function is how you're beginning to access more of the unconscious. You could say, yes, it's having an impact on the nervous system and how the nervous system functions, how fortified or relaxed the nervous system is. But if you bottom line it, you could just say how you access the unconscious is tied to the breath. And if you slow down the breath, if you deepen the breath, any of these components, you actually are starting to tap into more subtle emotions, more subtle thoughts. You're able to see your thoughts in much greater depth rather than just like two-dimensional. There is a reason why when you have sharp stabbing pain in the body, it impacts this center and causes your breath to be short and rapid. It's because of you're trying to keep out the unconscious feelings, the unconscious instinctive responses associated with being in pain. You're trying to manage the pain in a way that, you're trying to not be uncomfortable, you're not trying to hurt, you're not, nobody wants to be in pain. And so it's just your body's mechanisms of how this all works. Then from there, you're going to then treat the throat. And when you go through and treat the throat, again, you're increasing lymphatic function and you're increasing lower mental faculties, but you're literally breaking down the conditioning from the past. You're beginning to release elementals, which are the energies from the environment, and you're basically breaking up thought forms. You're separating it into elementals and thought energy, right? Thought energy. And then once this has all happened, it actually starts to release out of the back head. So it starts to impact the more primal part of your brain. So it allows you to not be in that instinctive mental faculty, which has like an accumulation of sorts. The more that gets conditioned, the more difficult it becomes to break out of that particular pattern. And so these two patterns right here are very important. The lower emotions is tied to eventually doing sexual transmutation, and the instinctive mind is tied more to the forgiveness pattern, which is tied to the low back or Mingmen, the back heart, and the crown. And so that helps to break up instinctive mental responses, and the sexual transmutation begins to transmute the lower emotions. Now, the thing that you're trying to do here is you're unwinding. I'm trying to think of how much I should say and not say. You're beginning to unwind thought forms, but you even break it down more. You're breaking down thought forms. You're breaking down the energy of thought, and then elementals. And so this would be tied to what people call psychosomatic, but psychosomatic is really misleading. It's not. People's perception of psychosomatic isn't super accurate. You could say that the body has like kind of armoring, or you have like these like patterns in your body, even in the muscle and the fascia and the organs. To a certain extent, you could call that psychosomatic. You could call that armoring or a protective mechanism. Psychosomatic issues are usually protective in nature, but protection gone awry. I mean, that's the misperception about psychosomatic. It is protection that is not beneficial. Like, your body just hardens up or clamps down or tightens up in areas to keep emotions or thoughts in or not being processed. It's a byproduct of lower emotions and instinctive mental function. And so a lot of times when you go through and you unwind some of these things, there might be emotions that come up. There might be mental processes. The person might get upset, might get angry, might cry, um, might check out a little bit. But that first component where you go through and you put rosemary or the saffron here, the mugwort on the arms and the legs, and the bay laurel really helps keep everything moving. It also, in that first component, spikenard on the feet between the toes and the arch of the foot really helps to calm down the lower emotions. And so very, very beneficial as well. And so, there's that cream that I made that has spikenard in it. Part of it is to relax the feet, but part of it is also to calm down lower emotions. And so let's talk about oils that you can use for this, right? So there's a couple different ways that you could go through and process this. And so usually right off the bat, you're breaking up, you could say thought forms in a way, right? You could say thought forms. And so in the Bible, when Solomon uses hyssop, he says, purify me with hyssop, make me white as snow. There's a reason why I'm always pushing hyssop, like hyssop, 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 hyssop. It's because it breaks down thought forms in the body associated with what people loosely call psychosomatic issues, or that armoring that can happen in the body. It's not the complete treatment, but basically you're helping to make space for more life energy, life force, or soul energy to flow through the body. And so even doing these patterns that we're talking about right here, just using hyssop can be quite substantial. Now, to take it a couple steps further, when we say stress, you could call stress a lot of different things. It's the ability to try to maintain some sort of balance. You're trying to stay in that state of comfort. You're trying not to be impacted by the environment, but basically what we would call stress, if you really boiled it down and you said, okay, describe what it is, but you can't use the word stress, right? Basically, stress would be energy of thought. Like if you really super boiled it down, it would be energy of thought. And so energy of thought is not a thought form unto itself. It is a component, right? It's something that's been thought repetitively or intensely or has strong emotion behind it that is generating energy, but until it attracts energy from the environment, it has not become a thought form. And why are we differentiating that? Once it becomes a thought form, it starts to have a little bit of consciousness, right? So when stress or when energy of thought mixes with elementals from the environment and starts to physicalize, that is literally what psychosomatic is. That is literally what it is. It is what armoring is. It's what you could even call pride, like negative forms of pride. Pride doesn't allow you to see what's happening because it's like a cast. It's helping you to survive, because if you saw or perceived or felt what was happening, a lot of times we don't have the self-esteem to work through it. So it keeps you functioning until there's a better time, right? So that pride is necessary sometimes, but it will manifest a lot of times in the body. And so I tend not to use the term pride. I even try not to use the term psychosomatic too much, but here there's no kind of way around it. But basically, energy of thought is broken down and released through the use of basil. Basil is in the African culture, they refer to basil as devil chaser, right? Devil chaser. It's what you would purify the body as somebody's getting closer to passing. It's because it starts to break all these things up. And here's the interesting thing. In some of the Hindu practices, like Lord Ganesha, for example, basil is used in devotional practices to Ganesha, which Ganesha is tied to overcoming obstacles. And think about what I've been talking about. If you're totally weighed down by lower emotions and the instinctive mind, there is no overcoming obstacles. Life is an obstacle. Everything in life is an obstacle. You have to go through and purify these things so that you eventually become like Ganesha, like you actually eventually become able to overcome the obstacles through the purification of the lower emotions and the lower mental faculties. And so the elementals are released through you can use any form of spruce really, but the one that like basically outshines them all is Sitka. There's a reason why I push Sitka so hard, and it's because of how well it treats elementals. Now, all of these, there's fancier oils that will do it all. They will do it better, but this is a way to treat it. First, it's more gentle, and two, it's cost effective, right? And so by the use of hyssop, basil, and Sitka, especially on the joints, especially on these patterns, you can anoint these energy centers, or you can do breathing on these energy centers. You can take baths in these different oils. By going through and doing that, you're unwinding. You're unwinding the lower emotions in the mind. Then, there's oils that we've used for the different transmutations, but in a month or two, I think we have it scheduled for February. We're going to be doing the strongest version of transmutations that we've done, and it's probably I'm going back and forth with. There might be even a prerequisite for that class because it might be so intense. I'm not sure how I'm going to structure it. The outline's already done, but it's not for a new person. Like it needs to be somebody that has done some of the classes and has done some purifications for a while, because it's pretty intense. And so it's meant to be a byproduct of the chakra classes that we've done, and those were intense purifications. They weren't the end, but they were definitely a stepping stone to something deeper. And even with what we just talked about without me going into the next phase, this is months worth of work, months. And so those three oils, the hyssop, the Sitka, and the basil, those are to be used for a while. And for trauma, you could use vetiver, but there's this other oil called ruscus that it helps to release trauma out of the body. It's different than like helichrysum, and it's different than poplar. It's gentle, it's soothing, it's calming, and in the early stages of releasing these things, you can just throw people into the deep end, especially if they don't have a lot of background in getting healed or meditation or things like that. You have to give the right dosage of medicine at the right time. And if you throw them too much into the deep end, it'll be too much, and you'll spit them out, or they won't continue. And so you need to make it done in a way that's digestible. The last thing that I would usually treat is fear. And there's an oil that we've had for a while, but there's Palo Santo, right? Palo Santo will work. But there's actually a different type of Palo Santo that's made not from the wood, but from the fruit. And it's a deeper, it's for deeper psychological healing, really super specific to fear, really super specific. But if you haven't done a bunch of, if you haven't done a lot of the groundwork for this, it's moderately successful. Like it's better to go back just to regular Palo Santo, just because Palo Santo will blow things out, anxiety, fears, things like that. Where this starts to be really deep, really subtle, a lot of more things in the unconscious. Regular Palo Santo made from the wood is more of the things that in the conscious mind and then slightly unconscious. When you start using the fruit, it actually goes almost all unconscious. You're treating the unconscious. And so there is stronger version of this, a much stronger version of this. The pattern is the same, but the daily routine of where to apply things is a little bit more involved. But it's too much at first. And so I would stick to this at first. So again, to recap, bay laurel, cleaning the lower centers, rosemary verbena or blue Tuscan rosemary to regulate the centers. Spikenard on the soles of the feet. And then mugwort on the arms. And even if they just did that for a little while, there would start to be a difference over a period of time of a week or 2 weeks or so. It also would allow for deeper healing to happen. Now, at this point, even if you don't follow everything that we just talked about and you were able to get them to do just those first components, one of the things that you could have them do is use the Moses and have them put it on the heart, the navel, the crown, again on a daily basis. And it just will gently flush these things out of the system. And so a lot of times with Moses technique, just doing the Moses technique, sometimes you'll get spontaneous healings of conditions because of how much of the lower emotions and the instinctive mind it clears out. But when you add these other components to it, it makes it deeper and more longer lasting. Then when you go through and you start doing the hyssop, the sitka, the basil, and following the patterns for the arms and legs and of the instinctive mind and lower emotions, it makes things a lot deeper and the person will release things. But that's where we start going into either doing some sort of transmutation, psychological healing, or that's really when we get in and start working with angels. Like the thing with angels, a lot of times, this is why I always like hold back when somebody goes, what angel is good for this? What angel is good for that? It's basically when we're asking for that, we're really reinforcing the instinctive mind, not trying to re-educate the instinctive mind. And we want to have the angelic energy come in to shift us out of that, not use it to reinforce it. So a lot of times when people try to use angels or angel work to do symptom-oriented treatment, they're actually doing the reverse. At the very least, they're just not doing anything, but they're usually doing a little bit of the reverse. And so there's a few angels that you would work with. Michael would probably be the big one, but other ones could be involved in this process as well. But Sabriel could be one as well. But at first, just do the first phase. Then after a little while, do this phase with the instinctive mind and the lower emotions. And then eventually we'll talk about how to do the stronger or deeper version. So I can keep talking and talking about this, but I think I've already talked over an hour. So we'll call that a tangent. And let's have people, even besides Megan, like let's have you ask some questions, because this is a really super important topic that they got brought up. But I probably have 10, 11 people doing different phases of this right now, just from the last 3 or 4 weeks, but over the last 6 months, probably 30, 40 people, just different versions of this. And so getting understanding on this, I think, is very important.